Yeah, welcome back in Football and Off the Ball with thanks to Sky. Don't miss Spurs versus Manchester United on Saturday Night Football live only on Sky Sports, a match that is shot through with hashtag narrative. To join us on the line and to look ahead to that game and what it might mean for both managers in charge as well is the Independent's Miguel Delaney. Miguel, you're very welcome back to the show.
Hi, Richie.
The latest on Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, because since Sunday it's pretty much all been Solskjaer talk, because his position would seem to be almost an untenable one, given the fact that, you know, the 5-0 defeat and the nature of it, and not only the goals, but the way United were set up, in terms of their mentality going into that game, in terms of how they reacted with yellow and red cards, and the fact that he only has 3 games apparently to save his job. How true or not is that narrative?
I actually think the idea of 3 games to save his job was much more true in the kind of immediate slipstream of Sunday than it is now. Because I think as has been typical at Manchester United basically throughout his 3 years, and even before that with Mourinho and some of the Mourinho's bad times, there's always that initial rush after a bad defeat, then things settle down. Well, that is connected, I suppose. I mean, for in my opinion, and from kind of speaking to people around the game, is the lack of true football expertise at Manchester United. I mean, the line that's come out over the last few weeks, and particularly after Sunday, is that, you know, they were quote unquote blindsided by how bad it was. And another one that's come out a lot is that there were never plans to change manager this season, or that was never anticipated, obviously. Now, I think anyone that knows football, anyone that doesn't have even the vaguest idea, could see that for so long the signs were here in the way Solskjaer sets up and the way he plays. He's never been on the level of Tuchel, Klopp, Guardiola, and is now being out-taught by pretty much the entire Premier League. So the signs were already there, and it's felt like all that has caved in, and that this was just because ultimately, no matter how good he is, a lot of the kind of the figurehead elements, the job and kind of the heritage of the club and all that sort of stuff, ultimately it still comes down to results, and that this was always going to be a point that they got to. So from that perspective, you know, they shouldn't be blindsided really. And you know, as someone put to me this week, if they had a proper director of football in the club or proper football expertise in the way that's been mooted for so long, then all these problems would have been spotted long in advance. But of course, as always happens, the dust settles. And now, from what I've heard and what I've been told, and also I suppose someone kind of concluding myself out of all this, it does feel like Solskjaer is largely in the job down to indecision rather than any real faith. And that there's this kind of vague hope that he can just kind of steady the ship, muddle through, and maybe make it till the end of the season before a calmer decision can be taken. But of course, I mean, that's a cycle we've seen before and doesn't get away from the ultimate problem, that it does feel like United have to make a decision on our next manager at some point. Now, my feeling is the hierarchy know this, but then the big question is over who's next, and that's something they don't really know.
Yeah, that line has jumped out at me a couple of times this week, whereby Manchester United weren't necessarily preparing for a new manager this season. Now that's clearly borne out of the fact that they gave Solskjaer a 3-year contract not so long ago. But you would also have to think that at some stage they do think about a new manager, and like at what point that comes along, and you kind of have to think that they, in the back of their minds, don't necessarily have that much faith in Solskjaer if that sentence is being bandied about at all.
But it's the thing, and I mean, and even the fact some of the ructions that have come out over the last week show it is precarious now. And I think, as most journalists have by this point reported, Solskjaer wasn't given any long-term assurances earlier this week, and he kind of knows that he's under real scrutiny now, and so are his backroom staff. But again, what might save him isn't necessarily good results, but indecision about what next. I think from my reading of it is that the club basically hope there aren't any disasters, but it says so much about the current situation that you can't guarantee that. I mean, another disaster could be around the corner. It could be as early as next Saturday against Manchester City. They could really do damage to them. I suppose from that perspective, it's maybe fortunate they're playing Tottenham, because as you alluded to at the top of the segment, they've got real problems of their own, and some problems are actually quite similar to Manchester United. But then the flip side of that is, what happens if United don't get a result against Spurs this Saturday? How bad does that look?
It's an interesting one. It's an interesting one against the backdrop of an incredibly leaky dressing room, which is what seems to be the case now, whereby this started, I guess the door was pried open a little bit with Pogba's interview after the Leicester game, whereby he was saying that they had to get to the bottom of why these kind of defeats, not necessarily these defeats, but these kind of defeats have happened. And now it's a case of there are multiple reports post Liverpool from, certain elements within the dressing room were never really convinced by Solskjaer's abilities as a manager, and that the last 6 months to a year have only served to really underline what they possibly were already thinking. It's hard to right that ship when the narrative coming from within the dressing room is this guy isn't good enough.
Yeah, basically. And it was always a thing. I think what has saved him in the past is that players genuinely like him. And that's another line that's come out this week. But sometimes that's been confused for good management. And of course, they're very different things. I think since we've all been, there isn't a person on the planet that couldn't relate to the idea that they like their boss because their job is made easy, but that doesn't necessarily bring out the best in them. And that's quite a fundamental human thing, really, whatever about football. And it feels like that's kind of almost the point we've got to at Manchester United, where they like him, but they kind of realise he's maybe not the best for their careers because ultimately they're not challenging. And you're right, yeah, it has been an extraordinarily leaky dressing room, particularly in the last week, but that's something that's only accelerated this season. And then, of course, we get into all sorts of bigger issues, like just how damaging the signing of Cristiano Ronaldo has been for the club, which of course points to much bigger questions about the direction of the club as a whole. How they essentially went for what was a celebrity signing and a short-term option. I think it's correct that the fear about what might have happened if Manchester City signed Ronaldo prompted a lot of this. But what sort of way is that to run a club?
Yeah.
And it just kind of sums up so many of the issues of the modern Manchester United.
You know more about this than I would, because you obviously would have, ear to the jungle drum more than I would. But like the Ronaldo situation, like I can only scratch, what's left of my hair on top, because when the Manchester City talk first appeared, like we were doing pieces on that Thursday night saying, how will Ronaldo fit into the Manchester City team? And the next thing you know, you have this train starts moving, which is fueled by former players. And I can't envisage another club of the stature of Manchester United whereby a deadline day signing appears so dictated by external forces and yet still goes through, and then ultimately has, despite his goals, this utterly malign impact on the balance of the team. Like the only people that seem to have leaned into this adequately are the social media team at Manchester United, because for them this is a godsend and increases numbers and reach and visibility and all that ugly management talk. But like for the team, like this has just been a disaster pretty much at all ends, and undermines Solskjaer to a degree that I don't think a lot of people would really recognise from the outside looking in.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, what kind of really sums this up on a very basic level is that the United team on Sunday were baffled. Solskjaer went for the same 11 he did against Atalanta because, as was seen from the Atalanta performance, as everyone has said now, as predicted by Paul Scholes, everyone could see the problems of that team. And yet Solskjaer went with it anyway. Now, I think some of the thinking from that has been basically that, and this sums up some of the problems both with Ronaldo and with Solskjaer as a manager, in that he almost feels he has to play Ronaldo, particularly after what Sir Alex Ferguson said to a UFC fighter. I mean, what an absurd sentence that is. but also, he feels he has to play him. But also, because ultimately, Solskjaer is not that sophisticated a tactical coach, he can't conceive of any other formation bar this 4-2-3-1 with Ronaldo in the team. And that is obvious. That has so many gaps that it's so easy to get at. Because I mean, it's not too difficult to imagine a world like, okay, even if Solskjaer isn't that sophisticated a manager, he has come up with some decent ideas in some of these games, and some of them one of them is it's a little bit like Nuno at Spurs, or really Nuno when he was at Wolves, or Nuno in his first game at Spurs against Manchester City, where the better team, say a Manchester City or Liverpool, play in such an obvious way and have such a structured ideology that's so deeply embedded in the team that you know how they're going to set up. So the easy solution for any manager is to respond to that, shape his own team around that, play defensively against it, and just get the team to apply themselves. And that's what Solskjaer has done very well, particularly in games against Manchester City and once or twice against Liverpool. It was United that got the draw against them in that initial amazing winning run that Liverpool had at the start of the 1920 season, just before the pandemic. But of course, with Ronaldo there, he couldn't do that this time. And again, but you said at the top about how it came down to this kind of the way the signing just took on momentum of its own. Again, we return to this problem of football expertise. If United had a proper football structure, like Liverpool do, like Manchester City do, and these are their main rivals, then really, unless there was an absolute injury crisis and an emergency signing was really needed, there's no way those teams or those clubs would have made the decision to sign Ronaldo in the way that Manchester United did. Now, of course, I know it was Manchester City's mooted signing of Ronaldo that did prompt this, but that's completely different because City had a clear gap in their squad. They needed a forward.
Yeah.
United just didn't need Ronaldo. And it's actually, so like, I mean, it was almost like the City situation just panicked them into it in the way a club with proper planning would never do. And in that, I think I'm certainly not the first to kind of raise this comparison, but it reminds of the Alexis Sanchez situation a few years ago, where there was such pride at United about getting him over City, but ultimately it worked out far, far better for City than it did for United.
What's the situation at United like now, given the fact that Ed Woodward is still scheduled to go, was it the turn of the year? Is there any succession at the moment? Is there any succession plan in place for him, that job, what the upper echelons of the club will look like beyond January 1st? Because that seems to be playing into a lot of the decision making around Solskjaer. Or am I reading that wrong?
Well, ultimately, I think the Solskjaer decision comes down to Joel Glazer. That's who makes it. But of course, that is informed by what he is told by people like Ed Woodward and who is supposed to be Ed Woodward's successor come 1st of January, Richard Arnold. Now, Woodward has for a long time been convinced, absolutely 100% convinced, that Solskjaer is going to be a transformative Alex Ferguson-style figure at United, that this is the effect he's going to have. And like there was one story, I wrote this last week, that one of the moments that so convinced Woodward was he was walking past Solskjaer's office one day and he saw him kind of mapping out the United team for the future, which, I mean, to be honest, would seem like, I suppose, a basic thing for most of us, but to Woodward seemed quite an act of foresight. But yeah, I mean, okay, so there is a little bit of not necessarily confusion. It just, I suppose, the United hierarchy has to be restructured once Woodward eventually goes. Yeah. But ultimately, the decision still comes down to Joel Glazer. But then, of course, and this is the thing we keep happening. It's almost like circular with United. We keep going up to kind of bigger issues here, and one of them is how the Glazers actually run the club, because the common approach with managers in the past has been that they won't actually move until there's a danger of not getting top four. As soon as that happens, and you could argue that's the case now, that's when they move. But again, I do think it's actually a little more specific this time, where I think if they had an ideal replacement in store, if Pochettino was available now, then I think they would sack Solskjaer. But again, that just sums up this circular issue with the club. Pochettino was available at this exact time last year. They didn't move after a 6-1. But in the meantime, we're back where we were, but the problem is that bit worse.
Pochettino helps us lead into talk of Spurs, because it's hard to envisage that a club who appointed their fifth choice manager for an ultimate replacement for Jose Mourinho might find out that he's not all that they would have hoped for this point of the season. The Nuno one at Spurs just looks like a desperate decision that all parties would probably be better off exiting out of as quickly as possible.
Yeah, he's wrong for the club, and I mean, there's even whatever being wrong for the club, there's more immediate problems, and that there's just no connection with the players. It's just dysfunctional there. They do need a change, but of course, all of that is reflective of something bigger with Spurs as well. And that when you stand back from Spurs, it does feel like what is happening at that club right now is they're basically still in the remnants of the Pochettino era. And some more cynical people around football would say that is actually, in all of his managerial appointments, that's the only decision that Daniel Levy has got right. Pochettino, he kind of looked out on that, and it did temporarily transform the club. Pochettino wanted a refresh at the end of the 2018-19 season. He didn't get it. Now we're in a situation where, yes, they have moved on half of that Pochettino team, but ultimately it's not say like an Alex Ferguson clear out. The core of the team, it's still very much that Pochettino 2016-19 team, and it just means that it's all gone stale. And only fostering that sense of staleness is that Nuno is basically just a similar manager in style to Jose Mourinho, but even worse, with less charisma. And it just fosters this sense that the Spurs project is it's just kind of surviving now. There's nothing exciting about it. They're a team that you wouldn't go out of your way to watch on television. Now, I suppose the irony of that is I'm at the game on Saturday, and this could be a hugely compelling game purely for how bad it is on both sides.
It's it's just such a strange situation that Spurs have found themselves in, because I'm not going to put it as a position of strength coming off the back of that Champions League final appearance, but they certainly were in a position where they could have built on that and built something really meaningful. And instead, that squad has withered. Their replacements for those who have moved away have not been near as good. Some of them have flattered to deceive, like somebody like Tongi and Dombele. They seemed pretty keen to get rid of, even though he was only 2 years into his contract there in the summer. It's an odd one. By contrast, West Ham, right? If you look, everybody looked at that David Moyes reappointment at West Ham and went, "Oh God, good luck with that, lads. You're going back to the Championship now within 6 months to a year," and they are looking like week on week more like a real team. It's probably built like Antonio gets all the headlines, but that midfield, if I was a Premier League supporter of another club on the outside looking in, that midfield pivot of Souček and Damien Rice is one of the best combinations of players, never mind the individuals, but combinations of players that you're going to find in that position anywhere in the league.
Yeah, completely. I think a lot of us were wrong on David Moyes. Now, Jonathan Liu in The Guardian did a big piece on exactly that this week. He has confounded expectations. It's a very, I suppose, quite an inspiring story of a manager that's both rehabilitated himself and almost kind of rebuilt himself or reimagined his own career. But in saying that, I mean, what this West Ham team remind me of, I mean, I think the stat went around the other day that it's Moyes' best start to a season since 04-05 with Everton. And that's what they feel like. They feel like his best Everton. As you say, that's a really good midfield combination. And it also means that this is a West Ham team that, like that Everton, that are really hard to get at. But also they're very sharp in the sense that, okay, they're not necessarily a kind of progressive attacking team in the way we'd say a Potter Brighton is or anything like that. But they know, like that Everton, they know exactly when to attack you. They're a very well-timed team and a very finely tuned team, and it's to Moyes' credit. And I think it would be to the benefit of this season and almost be we feel almost morally correct in football in terms of how clubs are run and things like that. If say Spurs kept on Nuno and United kept on Solskjaer, if West Ham were to finish above them.
Yeah. With the David Sullivan and David Gold axis behind the thing like that. We're talking about morally inspiring is not what I'd use to describe either of those, to be fair, Miguel.
I suppose purely in terms of how the teams are managed.
But Daniel Kretinsky is the name on every West Ham fan's lips, I guess, today. There's talk that this Czech billionaire is going to come in and buy 27% of the club. It's almost the last thing they need at the moment, because for all of the misgivings about Gold and Sullivan and Karen Brady, etc., like that talk has withered a little bit and gone away and has been in the background, replaced by how well the team are playing. This talk of boardroom, not necessarily unrest, but change, definitely, and seismic change, it could almost undo all the good that Moyes is doing on the pitch.
Yeah, I mean, like it's one of the things in the job I'm in now in London. I mean, there have just been various points where I've had to write about the pure dysfunction behind the scenes at West Ham. I remember in March 2018 there was, this is the point where the fans there was a pitch invasion during one game against Burnley. There was real hostility. This was something that came up at the start of the pandemic as well. And so this could cause, as you say, a lot of resistance to the owners to resurface and maybe just cause distraction. But on the other side, I suppose, it might also just create a sense of hope if there are new owners. I mean, I've only seen the story today, so I'm not too aware of the nature of what the prospective owners would be. But I suppose, as we've seen in other situations, the prospect of new ownership can also bring just that sense of optimism, that change, and I suppose more than anything, the idea that the next owners will spend more money than the current owners.
Yeah, and it's a weird one, because the alchemy around West Ham was so ugly. with the stadium move, with what was going on the pitch, with the lack of inspiration and lack of, I guess, support initially for Moyes' reappointment. Like, that club is on such a back foot setting that it's hard to fathom that the London Stadium now looks like one of the most impressive atmospheres to go to, despite all the flaws, many flaws of that stadium as regards it pertains to football. But like, it is inspiring to see a team that have been on the back foot for so long actually make the most of what they have. They haven't gone out and spent millions and millions. They've got a player, an inspirational figure like Declan Rice in the middle of the field. Damien Rice mentioned earlier on, not quite the same level in terms of his midfield skills. But I don't know. There's something always heartwarming about West Ham when they decide to come good.
Well, this is almost the feel of what's happened at West Ham now, and maybe it's kind of just a little bit of a nice different story for the game, because we're talking about the structures of clubs like Manchester City and Liverpool and best practice. Maybe there is something nice that, as you said, there's almost that alchemy to it, that suddenly a certain set of circumstances can come together under one manager, and by will and just a bit of more spontaneous plan, or more short-term planning, and a bit of calculation, you can make something like this. Because it does actually, what's happened at West Ham does to a certain degree go against a lot of trends in recent football history. Almost
all of them. Like, look at Mikel Antonio. Like, Mikel Antonio is almost, he almost reminds me of like a Paul Warhurst situation, whereby what was it, Sheffield Wednesday in that 92-93 season got so, threadbare in terms of their attacking options. Like, David Hurst had been injured for a large swathe of the season, so they went, this lad who we bought from Oldham a while ago, he's not really working out in defence. Let's throw him up front. He ends up scoring a handful of goals, getting them to 2 cup finals. And next thing you know, he's like a star striker. And similarly, Antonio was kind of almost thrust into that role. I can remember him playing right wing back, and that looked like being his lot. And suddenly he's one of the Premier League's top marksmen.
Yeah, that's completely it. And not just not just kind of such a rare goal-scoring number 9 now in that sense, but also he's a real figurehead for the club. He's a little bit like Troy Deeney at Watford in the sense that he's become someone that the fans rally around, a really identifying figure for the club, someone that's now seen as pure West Ham. Although, of course, Declan Rice is someone that would challenge it, but I think almost everyone expects Rice, not least given his contract situation, to move on sooner or later. In fact, to bring it full circle, this is one of the more interesting questions with Manchester United. Even if they got Declan Rice this summer, it's difficult not to think they still would have had huge problems.
Yeah, and suddenly that money coming in from the Czech Republic and Daniel Kretinsky and all that might change the complexion of Declan Rice's outlook at West Ham, and you never know, he could be an even better Mark Noble for a year's future and stuff like that. But it's interesting times ahead for West Ham, and definitely, as I mentioned, for Manchester United and for Tottenham, who meet this weekend in Sky's Saturday Night Football. Miguel Delaney from The Independent, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yes, thanks, Richie.
Mind yourself.